If you ask someone to describe a horror film, no doubt one of the first things they'll mention is the shock effect. Yet, the shock effect isn't necessary for a horror film. Many horror films don't have one, and many non-horror films have jump scares. This is the first horror film produced. It doesn't feature shock effects. A devil pops out of nowhere, but it isn't really a jump scare. It's more like a magic trick. The earliest horror films were either trick films or based on literature or mythology. With these literary sources, shock effects were scarce, as the works they were based on had to build terror by mood and atmosphere. You can't really have a jump scare in a book. The shock, the boo, comes from pranks and funhouses, not from the written page. Film, given its unique abilities to manipulate audience perception via montage and limiting the audience's point of view, combine the atmospheric and existential terror of genre literature with the startling surprise of the carnival funhouse. Yet, as effective as this combination was, the jump scare took a long time to develop, to mature into the startling fright we so often see in contemporary horror cinema.
What?
Much like that first devil in George Méliès's trick film, one of the first true shock effects came courtesy of Lucifer and of Danish director Benjamin Christensen. In the pseudo-documentary horror film Häxan, Witchcraft Through the Ages, the Lightbringer himself startles a monk. It is an effective shock, and if you imagine it alongside a full orchestra or a skilled pianist, as was common in the silent movie era, I imagine that this moment was truly startling. Another famous silent era scare comes in Phantom of the Opera, courtesy of screen legend Lon Chaney. Co-star Mary Philbin has a delayed reaction. The shock, the reveal, is for the audience only. Both these moments are great early shock effects, because they are more than just jump scares. They are also thematically relevant to their respective films. In Häxan, the devil represents temptation and corruption. The shock thus acts as a metaphor on a thematic level. In Phantom of the Opera, the horror isn't just about the boo, but also about how we see him as a character. He's both heartbroken and furious at Christine's betrayal, revealing his pain to the world and to us. It is a potent shock exactly because it captures the inner state of the main character. A good shock effect is exhilarating. A lazy one is dreadful. Lazy shock effects can be downright destructive to audience immersion. Sure, they work well in fun houses where you can go in for 5 or 10 minutes, get startled a few times, and then go out laughing with your friends. In the horror film, however, it gets old fast. And worse, the shock, once you've been startled, can sometimes relieve tension. This is not a horror film, but look at this moment in Unbreakable. Writer-director M. Night Shyamalan does something clever here. It's an opening scene with an impending train crash, but we don't get to see it. To do so would be spectacular, certainly, but it would take away from the tension of the plot. In Shyamalan's previous film, the modern horror classic The Sixth Sense, there are plenty of shock effects. Some are pretty good, and others not, but the film works incredibly well because the shock effects aren't the only thing used to elicit terror. Shyamalan manages to marry the literary heritage of atmosphere and tension with the carnival heritage of the boo scare, and he knows how to balance it without removing tension from the story. Each shock, whether effective or ineffective, are in The Sixth Sense tied either to the character development or character point of view. This is an important skill, one both innate to a strong filmmaker and one learned through a century of trial and error.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet.
With the coming of sound, the shock effect got a new weapon, synchronized sound, a way for the filmmaker to fully control the boo. Yet, cinema remained mostly reliant on atmospheric tension in virtually every horror classic of the early days of sound. But there's a particularly good one in Mystery of the Wax Museum. The monster is revealed, his true identity hidden beneath a wax mask. I've seen this in a theater with audiences who did not know what was coming. I did, so I watched their reaction, and it was much bigger than I had anticipated. Startled shock, followed by an ooh. Mystery of the Wax Museum is an excellent, if often ignored, pre-code gem, but that end shock remains truly effective even today, as it combines a villain reveal, a twist, a shock, and broader thematic elements. It works because it was earned. This shock, and the silent era shocks before it, are primarily emotion-based. Modern shock effects tend to be more sudden, more violent. Where did this development come from? The short answer is, from producer Val Lewton. In the early 1940s, during the Second World War, Lewton made some of the most atmospheric horror films ever produced. With them, he jump-started the careers of several directors, including Mark Robson, Jacques Tourneur, and Robert Wise. These films, Cat People, The Body Snatcher, Isle of the Dead, I Walked with a Zombie, and more, were a tremendous influence on cinematic horror language. And one particularly significant aspect of that was in the continuing evolution of the shock effect. In 1942's Cat People, after a prolonged scene of tension, the appearance of the bus, elegant, startling, shocking, was perfectly used to both startle us and to release tension after an atmospheric stalking scene.
You look as if you'd seen a ghost.
Did you see it?
This shock is perfect, both because it was the most overt mainstream shock effect used up until this point in film history, and because it was used to release tension at the exact right moment. The effect was needed here, and it did its job so well, it is often said to be the first true shock effect. While that's not entirely true, we've seen others before, the Cat People bus shock certainly is the most important shock effect in film history, and it set the path for what was to come. Lewton again tried for such a scare in the deeply atmospheric Isle of the Dead, with a long scene of tension building up to this moment.
Kill.
Now, this effect works because of all that has come before it, about an hour of tension built into the story. But while I love Isle of the Dead, I gotta say, I think this jump scare cheats. The shock relies too much on the sudden crescendo of music. Still, the film, based on a piece of art, is itself an artistic triumph, and well worth seeing. And the shock effect, while more boo than genuine terror, comes at the right time in the film's narrative. And that's the important thing about shock effects. To be effective, they don't just need to be logical story-wise or technically well produced, but they also need timing. Both within the individual scene and within the film as a whole. Within a scene, just having a shock come out of nowhere can be effective.
I think there was something else there with us.
But it can also take you out of the story. The timing has got to work.
I'm trying to tell you.
I don't need to hear your excuses.
I'm not
or
making
your
excuses.
bullshit.
And when viewing a film as a whole, the shock effect needs to come at the right point in the story. Opening a film with a shock effect is often counterproductive, but building up to it, making the last part of the narrative, when the character is at the most volatile part of their journey, well then it can be far more effective. Timing these effects to the danger the characters are in works wonders, because instead of cutting the tension, the filmmaker can then ratchet it up to a new level. This is an excellent, logical, perfectly timed shock. It not only tells us that the xenomorph is still alive, but also that our hero's situation just got infinitely worse. This is horror cinema perfection. Speaking of aliens, take a look at this scene from 1951's The Thing from Another World.
Go ahead and open it.
This moment works really well. It's a simple effect with an obvious man in a monster suit, yet it plays, mainly because the story builds up to this effect. The shock comes at the right time, narratively speaking. The filmmaking is on point, no doubt due to the efforts of producer Howard Hawks, an excellent director himself, and director Christian Nyby, a former film editor who certainly knew a thing or two about timing. Interestingly, the remake, John Carpenter's The Thing, doesn't rely on shock effects. Sure, there are a few, but mostly, that film is built on tension and paranoia, and Carpenter knows not to mess it up with lots of unnecessary jump scares. The Thing, despite being light on shocks, is in my opinion one of the most effective horror films ever produced.
I know I'm human. And if you were all these things, then you'd just attack me right now. So some of you are still human.
Let's hop back to the 1950s and the early 1960s. Back then, the shocks were still developing, and with more freedom from the fading power of the censors at the Hays office, horror cinema grew more violent and more startling. Jump scares were becoming more common. The master of terror, Alfred Hitchcock, knew how to exploit this development. One of my favorite Hitchcock quotes is that the bomb must never go off. There is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. You could argue the same is true of the shock effect. Hitchcock manages to prove and disprove himself in one of the greatest scenes of horror cinema, the shower scene in Psycho. We see the figure approach, tension rises, and yet we still get the shock effect with Bernard Herrmann's shrill orchestral jabs, a shock effect we saw coming. But it works, a perfect mix of tension and jolt, without actually releasing any of that tension. The scene breaks every rule it can, relying on loud music for its shock effect, telegraphing the scare, and yet it just works. A more traditional shock effect comes later in Psycho, when Martin Balsam meets a grisly end. Like Mystery of the Wax Museum, I saw this one in theaters, this time with a friend who'd never seen Psycho before, and he nearly jumped out of his seat. And here too, the tension isn't cut by the jump scare, and that's because Hitchcock times it well in the narrative. Without Arbogast the detective, the danger increases, and so does the tension. What's really interesting is how Hitchcock still telegraphs the jump scare, the killer ready to strike, and the chosen camera angle foreshadows the fright to come. It works, because Hitchcock was both a great craftsman, an artist, and a storyteller with a strong sense of character. This, however, is where many films don't succeed, where the shock effects become obvious and distracting. There's a fine line between an effect coming out of nowhere and being foreshadowed. In many bathroom scenes, we're just waiting for something to pop up in the mirror, and it gets old the more this device is used. The filmmaking becomes obvious, and the audience starts anticipating the fright effect rather than getting lost in the storytelling. So, is it better to foreshadow the shock, or to let it be a surprise, or to forgo the shock altogether? Well, it really depends on the film, and on the purpose of the scene.
Wouldn't get that close if I were you. Just a suggestion.
Water's murky.
Take a look at this moment, which is related to Psycho in that it kills off the person we thought was the lead character.
And we're gonna find a way to get out of here. First, we're gonna seal off this room.
This was fun the first time I saw it back in theaters, but it doesn't hold up that well. I won't tell you that Deep Blue Sea is a classic, but it's got its merits. However, I truly wish the filmmakers had held on the wider shot instead of doing this. I believe this scene would have been better if they just let it come out of the blue, because the point was the complete and utter shock of the moment. Now, it's easy for me to sit here from the outside, opining about the merits of a shock effect, whether or not to telegraph, if it relies too much on loud music or loud noises, if it is just a damn cat. I actually forgive Alien this one, being such a magnanimous opiner of opinions, but also because it pays off with a terrific callback later on. But seriously, good shock effects are hard to do, and filmmakers often feel pressured to add them, both due to genre conventions or due to demanding financiers. Hopefully, these demands happen at the screenwriting stage, where a writer can imbue the effect with thematic relevance. Naturally, as a screenwriter and novelist, I would say that. But seriously, the most effective shocks are directly related to the themes of a story. Take Mario Bava's aptly titled film, Shock. The movie came out in the end stages of his career in the 1970s. Horror cinema was at the time evolving, becoming more vicious, and the 70s saw some of the biggest leaps forwards in the evolutionary development of the shock effect. In Bava's film, Daria Nicolodi begins to suspect that her son is possessed by her deceased abusive husband. And then, this happens.
Mama!
Bravo! Now that's a clever use of a jump scare. Entirely thematic, effective, and done without any cuts. It's just a bit sad that it's undercut by a less effective jump scare only 1 minute prior. There were many worthy shocks in the 1970s, shocks that elevated the horror narratives of their films, that made sense in context of their stories, and that further evolved the art of horror cinema. But success spawns imitation, and imitation can so quickly get old.
It's Carrie!
With Carrie, Brian De Palma did Stephen King's breakthrough novel a great service, supplying the already successful and compelling book with a haunting, troubled visual narrative that has echoed throughout horror cinema history. With that final shock effect at the end, a final boo for an already traumatized audience, De Palma opened the floodgates. Suddenly everyone, even today nearly half a century later, now wanted a shock effect at the very end of their film. And it is irritating. Granted, I love a good nihilistic horror film. But I also love a horror film with a happy ending. Oh, that overused final twist. Boo! Screw you, main character, you still die! All for the sake of one final scare. No! It worked in Carrie, because it was new and it spoke to trauma, even if it was just a dream. Sure, that's cheesy, but it still works because it says something about the mental scars Carrie left behind. And Carrie is, both as a book and a film, a story about such traumas. The jump scare works on a thematic level. A bit less earned, yet still fun, is the end of Friday the 13th. Cheesy and illogical? Sure, but it gave us Jason as a monster, rising in his now dead mother's stead, carrying on a legacy of homicidal brouhaha. To me, it works because of two reasons. One, it gave us a fun series of silly, lovable slashers that are joyfully stabby. And two, it works because it hadn't yet, in 1980, been done to death. And here's another example. The final jump scare of A Nightmare on Elm Street works much for the same reasons as with Friday the 13th. Though I have heard many people say that this is the weakest moment in the horror classic. Not sure I agree, but to each his own. For every final jump scare that worked, there are 10 that just didn't. Jump scares that were either unearned, uninspired, or that went against the thematic elements of the story, thus feeling disharmonious and cheap. From the 1980s until today, the prevalence of the shock effect has grown exponentially, and there are so many worthy and unworthy scares to mention that I can't possibly cover them all. But I can say with certainty that the art of the boo has evolved, becoming a staple of horror cinema, and sadly, in some cases, a burden on the genre. For instance, the first American remake of The Grudge bothered me because it indulged in shocks to such a level that I lost focus, and then truly nerve-wracking scenes like this became muted as I stopped paying attention to the story. The Japanese original, also directed by Takashi Shimizu, that one felt far more balanced. The overabundance of shock effects, with the demand that horror films must have them, made them less effective overall. Yet, clever filmmakers persevere, creating narratives where shocks are justified. Sometimes they indulge in shock effects with such pitch-perfect precision, like director James Wan, cinematographer John Leonetti, and editor Kirk Morey do in The Conjuring, that the parade of shocks themselves become a symphony, working perfectly even when they should overwhelm you and pull you out of the story. Sometimes in otherwise forgotten films, they have clever shocks that don't rely on cuts. Sometimes, the geography of the set is pivotal, creating a fright for the ages. Sometimes masters shock you without using sound. And herein lies the challenge of the shock effect, an effect that evolved with cinema, that flourished with the development of cinematic language, and that suffered, like some woodland creature, from an overabundance of nourishment, growing much too numerous, and thus cannibalizing its own effectiveness. The shock effect is difficult, and it is far from always beloved. I myself am often annoyed by it, like a joke that drags on past the punchline. But now and then a great storyteller comes along, and with them, the punchline of the shock becomes artful yet again. And for those moments, those few moments of true terror, terror that endures instead of cutting tension in half, I will happily suffer through the failed attempts. For the true shocks, those jump scares that change horror cinema and horror language, they are worth it. My name is Wolfcraft. This is History of Horror. If you enjoyed the episode, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you feel like I neglected some good genre-bending shocks, give them a shout out in the comments. Thanks aplenty.